So this video, I'm going to work through the Unit 3 study guide with you. So the first thing that we need to look at is the first problem. It says that we're going to solve by graphing. So you have to make sure that you know how to do this in the calculator. So we'll take a look at our calculator. So we're going to go to y equals, and we're going to do negative 6x squared minus 12x. Then I'm going to hit graph. Now, if for some reason your calculator doesn't look like what you think it should, you can always go to Zoom 6 and it will put you in a standard 10 by 10 window. Okay, so I'm going to go to second, calculate, and I'm going to go to number 2 for 0. Now, if we read a sentence from left to right, we read a graph from left to right. So the left bound, so it's going to be the left side of that first 0. Then I'm going to go to the right side of that 0 and then enter through guess, and it gives me my first 0 is negative 2. So I'm going to go to second trace again to find my second 0. So I'm going to come around. So the first side I come to is the left side, so that's the left side. Then the right side, and then guess, and I get two zeros, one at negative 2 and one at 0. Remember that you can also rely on your table, but if your zeros are not whole numbers, they may not show in your table. So you want to be sure that you know how to do both methods in the calculator. So that means on my 0 line, I'm going to write negative 2, comma 0. Now we can use that set notation or not. It's totally fine. I won't count off for not using set notation on the test. So the second one is the square root property. So remember, for the square root property, the idea is to get the squared term isolated and then square root both sides. So remember, when we're simplifying an equation, we do PEMDAS in order. When we are solving for something, we do PEMDAS in reverse order. So I am going to subtract 7. So add and subtract first. So that gives me 4 times quantity x squared is equal to 320. Please remember that you cannot distribute this. Exponents comes before multiplication. Also, this is not x squared plus 1. This is x plus 1 times x plus 1. So you cannot simplify this as x squared plus 1. So I'm going to divide by 4 on both sides. So I have x plus 1 quantity squared is equal to 80. Now, in order to get rid of a square root, I know that whatever this value is has to be equal to the square root of negative or positive square root of 80. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides, and I get plus or minus the square root of 80. Now remember, I would not touch this radical until I got x on a side by itself. It will quite possibly keep you from making a mistake. So I have x is equal to negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 80. So I need to figure what perfect square is in 80. Now you might be tempted to think 8 and 10 because it's so easy, but neither one of those numbers is a perfect square. So I know 80 is divisible by 4, but notice there's still a 4 in 20. So if it's divisible by 4 and divisible by 4 again, that means that 80 is divisible by 16. So 5 is a nice prime number, so I know that I've gotten the largest perfect square out that I can. 5 doesn't have any factors that could possibly contain a perfect square. So I'm going to come back and I'm going to write 16 times 5. No, yes. Okay, so then I have negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 16 is 4, and I have 4 square roots of 5. So that's what I'm going to write on my number lines. On my answer line. Negative 1 plus or minus 4 square roots of 5. The second method is completing the square. So remember, to complete the square, the first thing we're going to do is get my x terms on a side by themselves. So I have x squared minus 10x, and I'm going to draw my blank. It's equal to negative 7, and I'm going to draw my blank to keep my equation balanced. So remember, to get what goes here, we take half of the center term and square it. So half of negative 10 is negative 5, and negative 5 squared is 25. In order to keep my equation balanced, that means I also have to add 25 on this side. Now remember, the whole purpose of this method is to get this to be a perfect binomial square. So we should get something that looks like this. Okay, so how do we get this? Well, it's always going to be x, and it's always going to be half of this term, because negative 5 plus negative 5 is 10, and negative 5 times negative 5 is a positive 25. Now from here, it's just the square root property again, so I'm going to square root both sides. I get x minus 5 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 18. So I have positive 5 on both sides, so I have x is equal to 5 plus or minus the square root of 18. So remember, I'm not going to touch that radical until I have x on a side by itself. So I have x is equal to 5 plus or minus the perfect square, the largest perfect square in 18 is 9 times 2. So I have x is equal to 5 plus or minus the square root of 9 is 3, and then 2 is still under that radical. So I have 5 plus or minus 3 square root of 2. So the last method that we're going to use is the quadratic formula. So remember, to use quadratic formula, everything has to be on the same side. So I'm going to add 3x to both sides. So I have then 4x squared plus 4x is equal to negative 8. So I'm going to add 8. So I have 4x squared plus 4x plus 8 is equal to 0. So then I need to identify my a, b, and c. So a is the coefficient of the x squared term, b is the coefficient of the x term, and c is my constant. So I need to know that my formula is the opposite of b, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So I have x is equal to, the opposite of b is negative 4, plus or minus the square root of 4 squared minus 4 times 4 times 8 all over 2 times 4. So I have x is equal to negative 4 plus or minus the square root. So I'm going to type that in my calculator. I'm going to show you how I do it. So I'm going to do 4 squared minus 4 times a times c, and that gives me a negative 112. So I have negative 112 over 8. So I know the first thing I have to do is get that I out, get that negative out. So I have negative 4 plus or minus I square root of 112 over 8. So I'm going to have x is equal to negative 4 plus or minus I. I need to figure out what perfect square is in 112. So I'm going to try 112 divided by 4. Now 28 still has factors left in it, so I'm going to have to go through the factors and figure out if it's divisible by a perfect square. And 28 is still divisible by 4. So if 112 is divisible by 4 and then divisible by 4 again, then 112 is divisible by 16. So 7 is a nice prime number, no factors left that could possibly be a perfect square.